Yes, it's preparing the live stream.
Okay.
Yes, it's preparing the live stream.
Okay.
I just heard that repeated. Is that normal?
That was the YouTube.
Yes.
It's preparing the live stream.
Okay.
Now, why are we hearing it the third time?
I just heard that repeated. Is that normal?
That was the YouTube.
Yes.
It's preparing the live stream.
So is somebody on YouTube right now? Does somebody have YouTube open on their computer?
Yeah, I had to in order to start it, but then I tried to just click it away and it was, so now I think it's going.
On the top of the screen, it says live YouTube.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to hand hosting to you. It's very finicky. And
Yep, we're still good.
we're recording.
Yep.
Sarah, thank you for doing this. It's really wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure. So
I'm going to hide. And because I'm sorry, I have to meet someone. So I'm a little nervous about leaving. Do you think I could leave or do you think I should just hide?
I think you can leave.
Okay.
I mean, I'm the host. I don't think it's going to change anything if you leave.
Okay. So if it all falls apart, send me an email in the next 10 minutes and I will monitor my email.
Okay.
And then we'll just do it all over and I'll just stay. I mean, I'll make my computer stay. Okay.
Okay.
Have a wonderful time. I'm really looking forward to seeing this one in the rerun. Thank you.
Great. Bye.
Okay. The world hasn't exploded. I have to say, I live on Zoom, so I'm not all that nervous about this.
Yeah, I do it often enough now that even when there is a problem, it usually gets resolved pretty quickly.
When the pandemic started, we shut down in the middle of March, and we were up and running Zoom programs by the first week of April.
Wow, that's great.
And the first couple ones were just terrifying. It was just god awful. But it got better. And at a certain point, everything you can think of has gone wrong. We've had hosts guests who lost power. So that doesn't work. Your internet doesn't connect if you have no power. Everything you can think of. People who've had medical emergencies. I mean, it's everything you can think of.
Well, let's hope it goes smoothly today.
Yeah. Well, it's a Friday. What can go wrong on a Friday?
Right.
We have about 4 people in the waiting room. So, but 5.
I know 2 of them. They're footwear makers.
All right.
Cool.
We did a big exhibition on fashion a couple of years ago. We worked with, got them spacing on her name, Kimberly Alexander.
I don't know. I don't even really know what Mass History Commons is.
So I'm with the Mass Historical Society.
Oh, okay.
So.
Maggie Holtzberg from Mass Cultural Council suggested that I do this talk and propose it, and so I sent the email in, and then that was the extent. I don't know. Is this something tied to the Mass Historical Society?
No. So the Mass History, the confusing because everything's called Mass History. But the Mass History Alliance is a independent nonprofit organization that essentially works to support other historical societies within Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Historical Society is the oldest historical society in America. We date back to 1791. We have a collection of 14 million manuscripts.
Oh, wow.
And a giant endowment. And so they're sort of 2 completely different entities. The Mass History Alliance was formed just a handful of years ago. Mass History Society has been around, since you could write to Paul Revere and he would write back. They're 2 very different groups, but I work for the Mass Historical Society and I'm a board member for the Mass History Alliance.
Excellent.
And this is a project of the Mass History Alliance.
Cool. Just a heads up, my friend Paul Krause, who is a bootmaker in Arizona, does not usually understand mute. So I don't know if you can mute from there if he ends up talking to his wife and it's really loud and He's a little bit older.
I can mute.
Just a heads up that that may happen.
Okay.
He's wonderful. They're both wonderful people.
Okay, so we've got about 3 minutes and then we'll let people in. And I have a script to read, which
Okay.
is somewhat lengthy, but it was not written by me, so I'm not responsible.
Okay.
I always think that like long introductions don't help anyone. The introduction should be as short as possible.
It was probably, if it's my introduction, it was probably just taken off of like the written things.
No, there's like a whole thing about what the history studio on the Commons is. It's,
Well, that's a good thing since I didn't really know.
Where are you based, by the way?
Wakefield, just north of Boston.
Okay.
So I grew up in Lynn and in Swampscott. So I got a healthy dose of seeing what two different worlds are like.
Mass Historical is in Boston, not surprisingly. We're right next to the Berkeley School of Music, if that helps.
Yeah.
So in the Fenway neighborhood.
I know it well. My mom was the executive director of Little Brothers Friends of the Elderly for 25 years or something. So we visited elders all over Boston. There were quite a few like in that area, which, seems
Actually,
swanky. You'd think it wouldn't be, but there were a lot of very poor old people that lived around there.
yeah, well, there's a lot of, I mean, I could get into this in a lot more detail than we have in a minute, but there's a lot of social service agencies around this area. And that includes a number of like affordable housing groups and a number of housing co-ops. It's more economically diverse than people might think. And 20 years ago, it was a relatively depressed area. So it's now increasingly becoming wealthier, but that's a relatively recent occurrence.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have got 9 people in the waiting room. Give it one more second and then let everyone in. Okay, so it's 12 o'clock. Are you ready to go?
Yep.
All right. Admit everyone. Okay. So we're just letting everyone get into the Zoom space here, so we'll get started in just a second. Okay. I think some people are still joining in, but I think we can get started. Good afternoon. My name is Gavin Cleespies. I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to our History Studio on the Commons this afternoon. The History Studio on the Commons is a project of the Mass History Alliance. We're happy to have you here. The History Studio is an online space available to all practitioners in the field of public and local history in Massachusetts. Apply to host your own online workshop, lecture, presentation, film, or other project in the History Studio. You tell us about it and provide the PR. We send it out and provide the platform, the hosting of a Zoom meeting. Just fill out the form and we'll get in touch. I will post the link to how to apply in the chat as soon as I'm done talking. We reserve the right to choose which programs to host on our platform. Running platforms cost real money. The main sponsors of the Mass History Alliance are the Mass Humanities and the State Historical Records Advisory Board, Mike Pataski, and the Dorchester Historical Society, as well as people like you. If you wish to contribute, I will also post a link to where to contribute in the chat as soon as I'm done talking. And now, with no further ado, let me introduce this afternoon's program. Bootmaker and artist Sarah Gurin is an artisanal keeper of tradition in Massachusetts and a working artist. With a thorough knowledge of traditional Western bootmaking, Sarah researches and analyzes the connections between evolving methods of footwear making craft of the 1800s in Massachusetts, with an architectural focus on vernacular 10-footer shoe shops. To the stability of a contemporary art practice heavily based in handmade footwear techniques and skills. Sarah holds degrees in fine arts and architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design, was certified in footwear and at Cordwainers College, London College of Fashion, apprenticed with Colorado bootmaker Jim Covington, founded the bootmaking studio Sabotees, which I may have just mispronounced, and is a mentor artist in the Mass Cultural Council Traditional Arts Apprenticeship Program. Q&A to follow the presentation. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to Sarah, and I will now post everything that I promised to into the chat.
Thank you. Thank you, Gavin. I'm going to share my screen to begin. Bear with me. Can everybody see that? Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I am Sarah Gurin. I live in Wakefield, Massachusetts, just north of Boston. I am from Massachusetts. I'm originally from Lynn and then Swampscott, which is the small town next to it. And I am French and American. And I'm here today to talk about my practice and how my contemporary art practice might be indistinguishable to some from a custom bootmaking practice, and how it is informed by the history of Massachusetts, particularly the footwear making history. I see myself not as an artisan with artistry, but rather as an artist who has acquired the technical skills of bootmaking in order to execute my work. I founded the bootmaking studio Sabotees and in 2015. And it is really comprised of several different components, of which I'll talk about, and then the history of footwear making in Massachusetts, particularly 10-footer shoe shops, will become evident, I hope. These pictures here are all drawings of actual 10-footers in Lynn from a Lynn Item newspaper article published in 1899. And I was a Lynn Item delivery kid in the 1980s. The most straightforward part of my bootmaking practice and my art practice is that I do make bespoke boots for clients. So that means taking measurements and making boots for a particular pair of feet for a particular person. It is a business that I run, and in my self-imposed structure, I see that as practice executing my craft with my hands and my mind for the creation of my artwork. I have a hefty research component of my practice that, as I said, really focuses on 10-footer shoe shops. And that came about by wanting to build my own studio in our backyard. So I was trying to move my bootmaking practice out of our basement in our family home into a shed that my husband was going to build. And I was on the Wakefield Planning Board at the time and realized that it was a zoning violation to have a freestanding building for an art studio. And I thought this was fundamentally wrong. So I started doing research in order to rewrite our zoning laws and came across 10-footer shoe shops, of which I knew nothing about. And this is a disconnect with history that I try to solve all the time, because I grew up in Lynn and in Swampscott, where these shoe shops were once the primary economic base of the entire region of Greater Boston for many, many, many decades. And the fact that we don't know about them or learn about them very often is a problem. So these are small. A 10-footer was a small building, ironically, not usually 10 by 10 feet, but more commonly 12 by 12, but they came around that general size because they were such valuable workspaces that they were often moved around. So they didn't get much bigger than that. The buildings were actually moved from site to site. And at their heyday, which was probably the 1830s, these were the vernacular shoemaking spaces of Greater Boston, centered in Lynn, but also in all the towns that eventually became manufacturing hubs of footwear in the late 1800s to early 1900s. These buildings, there were as many as 300 in any given town or city. And by researching these buildings, I was able to make the argument that this was a use of freestanding small structures that absolutely should be continued in important ways as a link to our past, and I rewrote the zoning bylaws for Wakefield, which then passed at town meeting. So these are now allowable in Wakefield again. And the zoning language is actually pretty random. I think it was an unintended consequence of suburban zoning language to make these a zoning violation. But as I do this research around libraries and historical society archives in Massachusetts, I have found an unexpected affinity with the shoemakers of old that I didn't expect. This was pre-Instagram, so I was not very connected to a larger foot making community, which is pretty widespread geographically in the United States. But I started to also learn that my family story, which is of my father's an immigrant from France, coming to Lynn to work at GE, that wasn't just our own personal story, that it was part of a much larger context of immigrants coming to Massachusetts for industry. And it gave more meaning to my life and the kind of small identity crises that I have, being half European and half American. So as I said, and I was finding an affinity with these shoemakers of old, I also found an affinity of condition working in this 10-footer. So when it's really cold in the winter, I have firsthand accounts of shoemakers in the 1800s who worked in 10-footers who were really cold in the winter, and we found similar solutions to how to work and live and be in this craft practice. So on the really, really cold days, I'll go to the Lynn Library and just do historical research. And this is one of the books that was literally just handed to me across the counter, a book from 1700s that I really carefully started flipping through. And this shoemaker had been at the Battle of Concord. And I found this just so remarkable that we think of this history as being so removed and divorced from our conditions today, but they really aren't. As I'm reading this book, I could be this guy. These are the type of notes that I keep track of my leather purchases and my clients. And I started also finding an affinity of practice, a specificity of habit. And these coiled yellow threads with the needles in the West Newbury Historical Society collection came out of a little tin that was from a shoemaker's box from the early 1900s. And this is how I coil my threads on the right. And any of us, like Paul Krause, who's joined here today, bootmaker, would know that you keep these little coils of thread, not randomly, but to keep track of your bristles, which I'll go into later. But also you can use these little bits of thread in order to keep the tunnel holes open in the toe part of your shoes if you're lasting with hold fast construction. And the fact that I could find a tin with coiled thread like this is a connection across time to an exact practice that isn't something that somebody necessarily taught me directly, but that has lived on through the tradition of all the knowledge that I have attained from different shoe and boot makers over time. And I think these connections are incredibly important. And one of the things, as I joined Instagram and found a much larger, robust, supportive footwear making community, is that I started thinking about how I am connected across geography, across cultural differences, across political differences to other shoe and boot makers because of the strength of our craft and the knowledge that we hold in ways that I imagine these shoemakers of the past were also connected in ways. So whether it's the polarizing times of 1775 or 2020, as the craft scholar Glenn Adams says, the craft is an invitation to mutual respect. And I find this to be true in my practice and reinforced by the historical accounts that I find. So I am a Western bootmaker. That means that I make footwear that is made in a specific type of construction and a tradition that has roots in European equestrian boots, deep histories in Mexico and Spain and the US Civil War. And this type of footwear construction really kind of solidified and has remained largely unchanged since the 1860s or so, the late 1800s. And as I explore these collections, these footwear collections around Massachusetts. This one is from the Historic New England Museum in Haverhill, or it's not a museum, it's where they store their collection. This boot here is the type of construction that I use and I make in my Western boots. And yet this is a sample piece that was for a patent of a particular type of shank. So it is in good condition and remains unworn. And when I went to look and study these boots in their collection, I'm only the second person ever to have asked to see them. And I really feel like we have this hidden wealth that is untapped here in Massachusetts that can connect us to all these different traditions that have remained pretty isolated. In my work, I think a lot about place and architecture's relationship to craft knowledge, how it either affects in a negative or positive light, like preserving craft knowledge or destroying it. I started to see the craft knowledge that I have, which is pretty unusual in Massachusetts today in these decades, as a cycle of knowledge that moved. So this is the independent industrial shoemaking school in Lynn. Right now it's the Girls Inc. The building still exists there, but it was a shoemaking school that closed in 1975 that I didn't know about, and I learned about from the bootmaker Lee Miller in Austin, Texas. So the fact that I learned about its existence from a oral history, a connection to somebody else through talking, is really important to me and stresses the importance of oral histories and sharing information with other people. And then this ad from the Boston Post in 1738 talks about a man who's a shoemaker who escaped enslavement in Salem, and he carried his tools in a bag. And my occupational peer, Marika Verploa-Chasse, who teaches shoemaking in New England now, talks all the time about how she could carry all her tools for making shoes in a bag. And the idea of architecture, space, tools, how you would have them, how you might carry them, is something that I think about in my work. So in this shoemaking school in 1975, in the final year, there was a student named Randy Merrill who was from Utah, and he returned to Utah and ended up establishing with others the shoe brand that's a multinational conglomerate, I think now, called Merrill Shoes, and most people have heard of Merrill Shoes now. But he sold his name and that company, and then has been a bootmaker for many years, since the 80s, and takes on students. And one of the students that he had was a bootmaker from Colorado who had learned primarily from a Texas bootmaker, Ed Martin. His name is Jim Covington. And Jim moved to Massachusetts in the late 90s after he married a woman from Massachusetts. And Jim is the bootmaker that trained me. And I started at a certain point thinking about knowledge as a thing to protect, rather than the boot sitting in a collection in a museum, but the knowledge, like how could museums or we as a society protect and collected knowledge. So this seed of knowledge and the cycle I was talking about came from Lynn, then went to Vernal, Utah, then went to Las Animas, Colorado, and then to Gardner, Massachusetts, and then back into my mind and my hands, a girl from Lynn. I'm an external thinker, so the presentations like the one I'm doing right now is part of my methodology. I also consider myself to be a keeper of knowledge. So I feel duty bound to pass on the things that I learn, the things that I'm thinking about, and the connections that I make between history and footwear making. I grant right to process my thoughts, so it's really great if I get money, but mostly it's a great exercise in order to articulate the things that I have been gathering. And I lecture for feedback, as well as trying to let the youth of today know that bootmaking existed before, bootmaking exists now, that this is a viable craft to dedicate your life to, even though it seems very difficult to make a living from. So I talk to school groups, I talk to the public at history museums, and I am a mentor artist in the Mass Cultural Council Traditional Arts Apprenticeship Program. Fundamentally, I'll come back to this theme that I do see myself as an artist who uses this craft in order to make the work that I feel compelled to make. So this is an example of how I was experiencing the pandemic. So those early months when we were locked down, my 10-footer was actually the perfect place to be. It was isolated and I could still keep doing my work. But it was very isolating, and fundamentally to me, the product or the thing I make is the least important thing, even though that is ironically the way that other people can access my work. The process is what's most important to me. It's how I parse and share experiences. It's how I say, I am here, we are here, and this is what I need to say. So this work from the pandemic, the boots on the right are a men's size 22 boot. They are over 2 feet tall. And they were part of a grant with pairing up artists. So I was paired with a graffiti artist who was painting the boot pieces along with a mural that they are taken with in this photograph. And I immediately followed that work with making mini boot, which was smaller than a $2 bill. And in analysis after the fact, I see that this is how I was experiencing the wildly swinging moods and information coming into us about the pandemic by making these really vastly different scaled boots in the exact same type of construction. So I'll give you some relevant background to understand how all the chapters of my life and experiences are the same body of work in my mind. It's a context of how footwear craft is my means of actual thought process and not a nostalgia for the past. I did go to RISD for architecture, and my final degree project was not a building or an urban project, which is pretty typical, but rather it was a narrative film about a master artisan who is obsolete in today's contemporary world. He buries his specialized masonry tools in coffins made of rubble, and the film referenced guilds, a disconnection to knowledge, mill building, skilled trades, and it really took me 20 years to see that I set the path for what I was going to become. It wasn't obvious at the time. At the time in Providence, Rhode Island, there was this massive urban renewal where they were tearing down these enormous brick former manufacturing buildings, but they had become artist studios and artist homes. And many of these artists were being displaced at the time that I lived there. I felt like it was something important to record, that I was bearing witness to an echo of something that was already gone, these manufacturing processes, but also the destruction of a new use of these buildings. I am at RISD, which was very design heavy. I was very critical of how there was not a stress or a value on craft skills. But what I didn't understand at the time, as I have over 20 years of becoming a craft artist, is that it takes a really, really long time to develop craft skills. And I have discovered that the way that I work is something called experimental innovation. And it is work that evolves and revises over time. So this example of this piece is a footwear structure study that I started on my own when I was at RISD. I had access to the foundry. So I started doing these casts of my feet that I was making aluminum base shoes for. And they had all kinds of functional problems. They were difficult to walk on because they were aluminum. I couldn't adhere any kind of rubbers to the bottom in ways that I tried. But it took over 20 years of developing the craft skills that I have in footwear making to be able to resolve this work. And it ended up turning into a sculpture rather than a pair of shoes. There was a sophistication of technique to the way that I solved that rubber bottom problem after I learned how to hand stitch soles that I could not have done. I could not have done 5 years ago. I could have done very poorly, maybe 3 years ago, but I could not have done without all the practice and dedication to that craft practice and skill that I've developed over several years. There's just a sophistication to that technique that takes time and practice. And this is something that cannot be stressed enough and is difficult for people that don't live this type of life where you work to better your craft constantly. It's never ending. And this work ended up being something rather than a pair of shoes. It became something to me that told of my experience of feeling like my body was deconstructed walking through public as a tall, thin white woman. I also only ever thought of school as a way to learn anything, to learn a craft, to learn design. I didn't understand that there were other ways to learn something, and that really reflects the culture of Northeastern New England, United States, and Massachusetts that I grew up in. I think of school as being directly correlated to education. So this is one of the difficulties in acquiring these craft skills because they generally aren't things that are taught in a school. The education that I got at RISD really did not go to waste. I used that architectural education every single day. But I went to Cordwainers College in 2007 in order to learn shoemaking, because this is how I thought that you got that education. And these are some of the design drawings and the shoes that I made through that program. There were striking similarities in process to architecture. There's design, drafting, building, but there was still something that I had a problem with in the school, that lacking substance, or I wasn't on the same page as the other people. And I really think that it's because schools, when they are established, cater to designers to be better designers, rather to focus on being a craftsperson. And the more I talked to my teachers there, and there was this incredible complexity of pattern making that I am grateful for having learned before going into boot making, and understanding industry connections and construction and how that works. So that really, for me, narrowed down what I didn't want to do. And as I was zeroing in on what I did want to do, they told me that, what you want is to be a bespoke maker, and that is not something that you learn in a school. So you should go out there and find a footwear maker or a boot maker or a shoemaker and study with them. And so I came home to Massachusetts and was incredibly frustrated because nobody here did that anymore, except for this one Western boot maker who had come from Colorado and moved to Central Mass. I studied with him for 3 years, and he impressed upon me all the time about how difficult it was to make a living at this, but that he loved it so much and so passionately that the people that do choose to be boot makers or shoemakers do it because of that passion. There was an integrity of construction to Western boots that I did not find personally in shoemaking, other than in probably high-end men's dress wear shoes. But it's like boot making found me, because this integrity of construction and the opportunity to have something that was functional, that had to meet demands of walking, of gait, of human need for footwear, but also had the opportunity for design and tradition and references to the past and references to people's character, was just, to me, one of the most remarkable, amazing craft and traditions. And I have never turned back since I started studying with that boot maker. I also found that I felt like an outsider in this bootmaking community because I was from Massachusetts and because I had no cultural reference to Western boots. But the more I research into the archives of Massachusetts history, the more I question, how could anyone from Massachusetts possibly be an outsider in footwear when we are at the root of so much of American footwear? I did find that this isolation just reinforced these questions that I keep asking in different ways about how do spaces support craft and that craft knowledge, and why was this path so hard if I'm from here? But is it because that cycle of mechanization and industrialization that killed handmade footwear knowledge in the US was able to survive in other places along the Pioneer Trail or out west, where the footwear making spaces might have stayed smaller? I don't know. These are the questions that I ask, and I hope that the conditions of a future of bootmaking and shoemaking can be informed by the answers that we all collect together. As I get good at my craft, questions arise to me about why leather was excluded from the American arts and crafts movement. That movement really supported wood, metal, glass, ceramics, and fiber as materials. And it really is the space that should have helped keep these traditions more alive and more robust in craft schools and those communities, and it just didn't. It was really excluded, and I try to understand why. Footwear as a comprehensive spectrum has never been embraced by the craft world, not really by the design world, a little bit by apparel, and not much by the art world. So it's really this tradition that kind of transcends all these spaces. I ask if that's because there's a social hierarchy that really puts shoemakers on the low scale that kind of transcends many cultures. And is it just because it's feet? Is it feet are the lowliest part on the body? But really, we are all connected by this need for footwear, and shoemakers are connected by this impossible task of understanding a foot in motion, the experience of walking, the longevity of footwear, how we make these around static molds, these lasts that I'll talk about in a little bit, but that need to make a piece of footwear that needs to work in motion. We think of things of wear, of repairability, and then there's added concepts of the global impact and disposability of the footwear in the end and the materials they're made from. I'm going to describe a very brief process of footwear making, and you'll see that by the fact that it's not very brief in reality, how complex this process is. So in Tom Brown's bag of shoes, or Marika's bag, these are the very basic shoemaking tools that you need. This could make a very crude pair of shoes, but this is all you need. And it's pretty remarkable that with so few tools, you can make a pair of shoes. But it's not as simple as having these 5 tools, because each tool requires ancillary skill sets. Like, for example, just the knives and the awls, you need to know how to hone well. I learned to hone from Howard Schechter, who's a master honer in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, which also connects me to this other world of tradition in Massachusetts. So here's just a glimpse of comparison of those basic tools that I just showed you before: a hammer, lasting pincers, awls, knives, and rasps. These are my basic tools that I use. So just in the hammer section, I have sometimes one hammer for one process in the as I'm making shoes and boots. I am not a collector of tools. I look for a marriage of or an extension of my hand. And I use as references all the time the United Shoe Machinery Corps, what do you call them? Catalogs from 1898 and 1927, Barnsley catalogs from England, and the Dictionary of Leather Working Tools from 1700 to 1950. And these are 2 of my favorite tools that really are extensions of my hand. So back to 10-footers. In shoemaking, you can break it down into 35 processes. There's probably 200 or more steps in each of those processes, but they are also broken into 4 main subgroups. So when I went to the shoemaking school, these subgroups here, design and pattern making, clicking, closing, and making, were separated into different rooms. They might be different floors in a factory. 10-footers, this is the interior of a 10-footer in Lynn, really just only making occurred in this space, and a little bit of clicking of the structural leather, but it was only making. Everything else was done in homes by women in the 1800s, when these shoemaking spaces were the primary place of making footwear in Massachusetts. This is my 10-footer, the interior, and I do all of those processes. So everything from design to that very end result at the end of making. And as crowded and full as it looks, I actually do have it divided into zones, so that this back corner is my design zone. I have my closing sewing machines over here. I click in the center work table, and then everything that's really messy and dusty, it happens in this end of the shop. My 10-footer is in Wakefield, Massachusetts, on the banks of a mill river that had the main mill building torn down just a few years ago. And like I said, it's divided into zones of cleanliness. As I research the different 10-footers and give presentations and read old newspaper articles and all kinds of archival accounts of how these spaces were used, I love examples like this. The Buttonwood Museum in Haverhill, Mass. is a Daniel Hunkins 10-footer shoe shop, and he established his shop starting in 1860. So this is when 10-footers essentially became obsolete. Everyone moved out of these spaces into these intermediary 2-story buildings that look like houses, and then very quickly into these large-scale masonry manufacturing buildings that as development in architecture happened, it affected the ability and the scale of footwear making as well. But Daniel was a different type of thinker, and he made his shop a bespoke shoemaking shop and repair. And he had this, he has a clicking bench, but he also had this little area at the front for receiving clients. And this was a new use in 10-footers, as almost every other account of these spaces, they were just kind of dirty, messy making spaces for the shoemakers. So I'm going to begin talking about my boot making process. All footwear makers have variations of this, so this is not a judgment on anyone else's ways of doing things. This is just what has worked best for me at this moment in time. And so history, as I bring it up to going through this, is in the context of my practice and how I absorb history in order to inform my work. So I start with lasts. So lasts are the form around which this type of footwear is made. Not all footwear is made around lasts, but much of it is. And this is how I make shoes. And a last, I take measurements of a person's foot, I take impressions of them, I get all kinds of information that informs the shape and of the last. It is not a direct representation of a foot. The shoe would not work that way. There is a lot of information that goes into last making, which is its own craft. But it represents the negative space inside a shoe. And design comes into play. You can have the same foot measurements in two very different looking boots and shoes, as you know. But it shifts, the idea of that design is shifting volumes, of understanding the foot and then shifting the volumes around within the structure of the last. So the last needs to, it is a static form, but it needs to understand the foot in motion and how it will change as it goes through the motion of walking. You need a right and a left last for the feet, and there is a set heel height. I did take workshops with Last Maker House UK, and a lot of the information and education that I received at RISD in sculpture really has helped me understand the concepts of last making. You can either make a last from scratch, as we're doing here, or you can call it bubble or adapt, which is taking an existing last or a vintage last and adding onto or taking away from the volume in order to fit the foot that you're trying to make shoes from. This last making history also came from Instagram posts from Lee Miller. And I really feel when I come back to this idea of place that I am uniquely positioned, having grown up here and living here, to make some of the connections of all these different bits of history. Because, for example, he posted this last making paper from that references Daniel Silsby here on the left in 1822. And George Parrott. And I remember seeing Daniel Silsby's name in this book over here, which is a firsthand account from 1880 called Sketches of Lynn. And I remember it because I know these streets, because I walked on Chestnut Street all the time as a child in Lynn, because George Parrott's house is right next to where my babysitter lived. And these connections to place, I feel, are very personal, that being a footwear maker and being from here allow me to make these connections. So for an exercise once on this map, I plotted with pinheads all the remaining 10-footers and their stories in 1890. And then the two big white stars are the houses I grew up in. And then this purple star over here is where my 10-footer is. Boot making itself has its own unique relationship to place and character. So this was a pair of bespoke boots I made for a client, and she wanted flowers of her childhood. So these thistle flowers that are supposed to feel like they're growing up next to her leg are something that reminded her of being a child in Argentina, walking through paths of thistles. And it's a different idea of connecting place to footwear. Clicking is a process of cutting out the pieces that go into making a shoe from leather. There are two types of leather: the structural hard veg tan leather, and then a much softer hand leather that might be chrome tanned or mineral tanned or even veg tan, but a softer leather. And these pieces, pattern pieces on the left from the Georgetown Historical Society, really demonstrate where the term clicking came from. So they're kind of like a hard cardboard, pulpy material that are lined. If you see this dark black line around the edges, they're lined with bands of metal. And that protected the edges of the pattern pieces from being damaged when you'd cut with a knife. And the sound of the knife, when you were doing it by hand, hitting those little metal bands made a clicking noise. And then that became the name for the process. And that process, as it became streamlined and started moving towards mass production, became these kind of heavy pattern plates, or I forget what they're called, but that you would hammer and then cut out like a cookie cutter. And then these big machines, like at the Harlech Skates place or on the right here, clicks them, the pieces out with a hydraulic press, something really strong. It's done with lasers and all kinds of ways today, but this term clicking, the word etymology came from that hand motion. And I click by hand, and I think about this every time I cut out my pattern pieces. When I talked about those ancillary skill sets that you need to know, just how you cut out the pieces on a hide and where the stretch and the characteristics of in leather of the different parts of the animal's hide come into play that are really important in the quality of the footwear that you make in the end. So here's, I use a L'Indispensable knife from France and these two Landis machines from St. Louis to click out the different types of parts of my boots. Here's a knife that I bought in England, the George Barnsley knife that is here in this catalog from 1927. When I talked about having tools that I have single uses for, I just use this tool for cutting out the relief wedges in the counters, which is the structural leather that grabs your heel. And this type of finding a tool in order to have the highest quality work at each step of this complex process is something that is just very thrilling and fulfilling as an artisan. Crimping is a process of taking the stretch out of a piece and also transforming that piece of leather from a two-dimensional form into a three-dimensional form. And clicking, I'm really intrigued by this idea of how 10-footer spaces were used, because I find like this West Newbury Historical Society collection crimp board was found inside the 10-footer, but all of the upper making at that time, which is called binding, was done inside homes. So I don't know if the women who were sewing these pieces first by hand and then with sewing machines, at first mechanized invention, were having their pieces crimped inside the 10-footers and then getting the pieces back. This is really intriguing to me how this actually worked between all the shoemakers. I have a crimp brake, which is this beautiful old tool that came from Texas and moved to Jim to Colorado and then to Massachusetts. I use two different types of sewing machines, and they were the first real machine that affected footwear making. And it was in homes and not in the 10-footers, because women were doing all of the upper making and the binding in their homes. Top stitching is another way of connecting me to history. So for example, there's this long-standing Western boot making tradition of putting monograms or initials on the fronts of boots. And when I do this type of work, I reference an encyclopedia of monograms that is here at the Boston Public Library, but its origin is in France. And it's just this wonderful reference that every time I do a new set of monograms, I'm not only calling on this history of Western bootmaking tradition, but I'm also calling on the history of hand sewing that women would do on their sheets and their linens. And I'm able to do part of that by hand, connecting me to all these different people. That's just a very thrilling and rewarding experience. And closing is that third major subcategory of footwear making, where you sew all the pieces together of the upper part of the shoe or the boot. And closing was called binding forever in Massachusetts shoemaking history. So I'm not sure at what point the terminology changed to closing, but if you are interested in footwear history and look through any of our archival resources, binding is the term that was used in Massachusetts. And at this point, all this work has been done, and we still aren't at the point where any of the work in the 10-footers was done. There was a massive amount of footwear work done by women in homes. And these are the type of uppers that women would have either, if they were married in a shoemaking family, hand to the men in their family at this point to make shoes on the last, to finish. The making is the process, so shoemaking. Or they were also sold piecework. So there's a lot of records in those type of account books of buying piecework from women, these uppers. And for me, for my boots, this is what it looks like. It looks like a big loose leather sock, and it's ready to go on the last. So insole is we think of it sort of in our times, because we're pretty divorced from footwear making. We think of it as like that thin piece of fabric or leather maybe that you slide into a shoe, or maybe you buy like a Dr. Scholl's rubbery one. But insole is actually like the foundation of a shoe that's deep on the inside of the shoe and often not seen in shoes. In Western boots, they're exposed. They are this veg tan leather that molds to your foot. And I like that integrity of exposure. So I make most of my boots with a hold fast. So there's this pretty complicated process of making this little ridge. It's called a hold fast on the shoes and preparing it to receive all the sewn bits of the upper. So Western boots are the type that I make are all sewn. There are no nails left in the shoe. Nails in my work are used as tools. So they're used to hold the leather in place while I prepare to sew it all together. And as I sew, I remove all the nails. And at the end, it will be sewn and held together with wooden pegs, but no nails. Lasting is the most complicated process, in my opinion, in shoemaking and in boot making. And it was the final invention in Massachusetts footwear, and this invention of the consolidated hand lasting machine or consolidated lasting machine that Jan Matzeliger, a young engineer and inventor in Lynn, made in a race to mechanize this production was the single most important invention that changed, aside from sewing machines, that changed footwear production. The number of shoes produced in a day increased astronomically with the invention of this machine. And it's a very complicated process that takes a lot of knowledge and know-how. And the hand lasters were the final shoemakers in Lynn or in England, and where these big shoemaking hubs were, that pretty much lost their livelihood when this machine was invented, because it took away the need for that very last and final skill. And it is a skill to do well. This is at the Lynn Museum. You can see in a version of that very first machine. This is just looking at some of the complexity of processes as you start to last, which is I stretched all that leather around, and all these little nails will come out as I sew all the bits of the boot to that insole. So and you last the toe, you put in structural leather. And then inseaming, this was another story I love to tell, especially to the kids. They like this one. So you're guiding, you don't sew leather like you sew fabric. You don't pierce it with the needles. You pierce it with an awl, it makes a hole, and then you're guiding thread through that hole. So we guide thread through these holes in the leather with something called a bristle. And bristles can be, today, they can be made out of metal. They can be little bits of fishing wire. They traditionally were a boar's hair. So this is a boar's hair on the right. And this is my bristle. I make them out of guitar string that I solder. And this was from a USMC catalog, hand sewing bristles back in 1927, I think this one is. And this term also has stayed. So you could call up a footwear supply store now and ask for bristles, and they know what you're talking about and might have any of those versions. But I love that the term comes from this original boar hair's bristle. And here are my guitar strings sewing this welt to, which is a strip of leather, to the footwear. What is so extraordinary about how cowboy boots and Western boots are made now is that it is an almost identical process to how all footwear was made in 10-footers in the 1800s. It's a construction type that was made with intent to repair. This welt strip allows for repeatedly putting on soles on shoes over and over again. These shoes, if they were children's shoes, could then be passed from person to person, because all you need to redo is the sole and some of the heel lifts. And essentially, you're building a shoe that's intended to last forever and can last for years and years and years if it's made out of quality materials. This is so different than our footwear production today, which is made with intent to fall apart and intent to go into the trash and intent for people to have many pairs of shoes that won't last a long time. The interior of any type of shoe or boot that has a heel needs support in the arch area. And it's called a shank, and it could be something that is manufactured here, or it could be a nail, which is part of the Western boot making tradition, that is heated and then pounded flat. I sew my shanks in this technique, which I was taught. So I'm continuing a lineage of tradition that came to me from Jim Covington, from Ed Martin. Not everyone does it that way, but I find it really satisfying to do this process. So you can see how it's really all sewn together and all the nails are gone at this point. Soling is putting that piece on. So everything from here down could be replaced over and over again. I wooden peg, so I make these little holes with this pegging awl and nail and hammer in these wooden pegs, which hold the leathers together. And what's so wonderful about this very, very old tradition that dates back to the 1600s, I believe, is that the wood expands and contracts at the same rate as the leather when it gets wet. And one of the first mass producers of pegs was in Georgetown, a man named Pillsbury. Peg Pillsbury was his name. And you can find information in the Georgetown Historical Society about his invention and his story. The Nomkeg buffer is a tool, this is mine right here, that most boot makers still use today. It is also, the name origin is from Massachusetts, because Sidney Winslow, I think I have another slide, who was the first president of the United Shoe Machine Corps, which was founded in 1899. His father had invented this sanding buffing machine. And here's a tiny little version of it here. And as it develops over time, and named it after the Namkeg native people and place that is Salem and Beverly and Danvers today. And this machine and the name still last today in the boot making community. And I want to go back to that, sorry. So this picture here is Freeman Winslow, Sydney's father. His 10-footer, he had moved from Lynn to next to the big, huge manufacturing plant called the Shoe in Beverly. And this picture on the right I took in 1999 when I was an architecture student, and heard that this huge building was emptied and going to be renovated as offices and other things. So a few of us architects went and took lots of pictures of the building. And even at this point, I didn't know that, the depth of footwear making, and was walking through there and seeing like old abandoned huge stitchers just sitting in this building. And I happened to take a photo at the exact place where this 10-footer photo was taken many years before. I stitch my soles by hand. This is not traditional in the Western boot making community, as that footwear construction developed in the 1860s, 1870s, where there already were sole stitchers, and that I think is much more common in the boot making community. I do it because I love bettering myself with this skill. Sorry. And here is some of the sole finishing. I use pieces of glass and different sanding grits. In some ways, working with leather is very much like working with wood, and I've worked in different workshops over time, and it's kind of thrilling to see the skills like transcend different materials. I use edge irons that are antiques. So a lot of these edge irons are used for burnishing and sealing up the soles. It makes the footwear look really beautiful, but it also is functional as it seals the fibers of the leather on the side just by compression and heat and burnishing and pressure. And I found this ad from Lynn years ago, probably early 1900s, of the tool makers that would go around from shoemaker to shoemaker and either like polishing up their edge irons or maintaining their tools. So many of these tools are found in historical societies. I go and help identify the tools for historical society because they are the exact same tools that I use now. And I have been trying to convince some of these historical societies that we should have some footwear artists in residence that use their tools, because the use of some of these tools would help preserve them rather than sitting without hand and hand oils holding the tools. Sole finishing is really making the boots look beautiful and pretty. You can dye them, you can paint them, but it also is functional as it seals these fibers, as I said. So back to my artisan versus artist. These boots seemingly are straightforward boots that one can wear, but I made these boots to my daughter's feet, who would not wear them as she's a vegan. And they're based on a beetle. You can see the beetle on the side, and don't know why I feel compelled to make something that I know someone isn't going to wear. But the more I made them and worked through this process of having a teenage daughter that has kind of put up emotional and psychological barriers between her mother, which is a normal experience. This is how I work through that experience of thinking of exoskeletons and how skins protect or allow touch and feel, and that just that hard leather bottom of a shoe being kind of like an exoskeleton, and how the soft, vulnerable part of a boot is on the top of your foot, and how different we are from the animals that do that. So this is, to me, I'm not driven to make a boot because of how it looks or how it might express somebody's character necessarily. I'm driven to make it because it's how I'm working through issues in my life. Boots are made with stacked heels, as were these old-fashioned shoes made in the 1800s and 10-footers. They're called lifts, each piece of leather, and they are put on with paste and with wooden pegs, and they can be pulled off as you wear. Some people's wear, a lot on the outside, and you can pull off them and put on a new one and just continue the longevity of your footwear for a long time. I love drawings like this in this old catalog that comes from Barnsley in the early 1900s. It shows the hand using this welt trimmer in a very different way than I was taught to use it in boot making. And I use this same welt trimmer around the heel to make this nice heel shelf or rand shelf. Here's another look at the stacked heels and all that goes into balancing them and leveling them and having a nice solid base for the boot to sit on and not be wobbly. The undercut of boot heels is part of that boot making tradition. And I use some of my old architecture drafting tools for accomplishing this. And then there's more artwork. So this piece to me, I made a pair of boots that are covered with 2,200 X-Acto blades, and again, felt compelled to make them. And as I was making these boots, it was kind of recreating, trying to sew these X-Acto blades that are quite dangerous to touch, recreating an atmosphere of hyper focus that was kind of an abusive atmosphere that I had worked in. And it was a cathartic process to make this work. And to conclude, again, I feel like I am a boot maker because this is my art practice. This is how I experience life and say, these are the experiences. This is how I work through experiences. This is my process. My process is important. And those ties to history are really important. I'm not a boot maker determined to work in old ways, because it's really kind of impractical in some ways, because the price point for this type of footwear is not accessible to 99% of people. But I'm a boot maker because these techniques and skills specific to handmade footwear, specific to Massachusetts, are my means of translating experience and making connections to answer the questions that I compelled to ask in life. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think that was an amazing presentation. As a person who is literally wearing cowboy boots as I speak, I thought it was quite fascinating, although I now feel very, that my boots must be very shabby. If members of the audience would like to ask questions, I'm sure Sarah would be happy to answer some. Nick, feel free to unmute.
Hi, well, thank you so much for this whole talk. It's amazing. So my background is I'm an archivist, but I'm also like a sneakerhead and footwear fanatic. So this was amazing. So I'm just kind of curious. So with what you were saying at the end, do you find that the bespoke boots that you make, are they typically more like custom artists type books, type boots, like where people are kind of have this particular theme or more outlandish concept that they want to see in it? Or are they kind of asking for more traditional standard looking boots that maybe don't have like some of the elements that you've highlighted, which are all incredibly beautiful and amazing?
My client work is relatively traditional. So almost all of the people that have hired me to make boots want boots they're going to wear. They're cowboy boots, they're Western boots. They want something with personal meaning demonstrated like on the character, their character, or things that are meaningful to them on the shaft. So it's not necessarily kind of outrageous art things, I guess. But they are all unique. I have not participated yet in the tradition of making very traditional Western boot patterns, whether they're stitch patterns or inlay patterns. And I just think that's a condition of the people that have hired me and what their wants are. And also that my strength has been in designing individual design. So I try to honor and respect that tradition of Western boot making while giving the people that hire me something very unique and personal to them. And I do think that the kind of the anthology of the boots I've made so far reflects that. They are pretty identifiable as being different than other boot makers, but I'm by no means the only person doing it that way. So the artwork, I don't know if that answers your question, but the art pieces, like the ones with the beetle boots or the X-Acto blades and stuff, I really see as something totally different, and those end up going into galleries and museum shows. They're not necessarily worn out in the world as footwear per se.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And thank you. That was a great answer.
So there's a comment from Kay who says, you have made the Grout Herd House Museum display come alive, and now I can help bring this area of history come alive as I try to quote you and share some of your research. I saw so many tools that I had names but lacked the understanding of how they were used. Thank you. So I think that's just a compliment.
I also could point anybody who's interested to the Georgetown Historical Society. So last year we got a grant together to identify all of their tools and spent many, many hours identifying them on video. So they are going to, I think they're still in the editing process of that, but they are going to have that available through their library, but also through their museum database. Because you can find any of these tools in catalogs, but not necessarily know how they're used or know that they're used today actively in contemporary living traditions. So we were trying to give access to that. Like, this is how an actual bootmaker today uses this tool, and this may be different from how it is in the past, but that resource should be available soon. I've also identified the West Newbury Historical Society shoe collection, which is a really, really thorough collection of turn shoe construction tools, which is a little bit different than bootmaking, but that's all in Excel spreadsheets. It's not video, but I'm happy to connect anybody to any kind of tool use at any point. It's thrilling to make those connections for people.
Great. So Red, you have your hand up. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, that actually was a complete perfect segue. I wanted to ask about the tools, because so many of these, we said traditional craft things, the tools are so very necessary for what you're doing, but also are their own rabbit hole of very craft skill of making the tools. How have you found that relationship as far as in your journey of coming from architect to boot making, and where are the tool makers that you connect with? Is there a similar whole world of the tool maker community that you sort of felt you were parallel with as you were discovering the shoemaking community? Is that still similar in the country, or where did you feel connected to that?
There are definitely tool makers that focus on different things. So like somebody like Dick Anderson is a tool maker in a certain way. So he made my inseaming stand, and he seems to be, like a universal stand maker for many footwear makers in the United States. I buy some shoemaking specific tools from a Ukrainian man. I think his name is Victor, but Starko Tools is his company name. But for the most part, I use old and vintage tools. So it's always this. I've gotten some from Brinfield. I've gotten some on eBay, but I've gotten some from France, and then I try and it really is hand specific. So I might get a lot of shoemaker tools, like literally lot, meaning many, and in an eBay purchase or something, and only 3 of them will be the right size and weight for my hand. So there are many people that just love tools. There are many shoemakers that do and will keep them all. I'm not that type of person. I am like, okay, I'm going to give all these other tools to somebody else to take, because I want other people to have a marriage of a tool to their hand. And a lot of it is just hunting and finding. And that has been my experience. I'd say, like, really in the last 2 years, I've been doing a lot of tool work with some of the local historical societies around north of Boston mostly, and feeling like these tools are being donated to them because people find a box in their attic and of course give it to the historical society to keep. They're a little bit overwhelmed and not able to either catalog, know the use of, or what to do with them. And there are footwear makers like me and more of us. I mean, there are a lot of people who are turning to these traditions who need these tools. So it's almost like I like to think of it as that they were held in keeping until people needed them again, and until this knowledge started spreading again. So I am trying to impress upon the people who hold these tools in trust that maybe we should try to make them accessible for use, because it's not going to damage the tools, but it's rather going to be a conservation or preservation process from my experience with them.
So it's 1 o'clock, and I want to be conscious of people's time. I think we have a very short question, which Kay said, do you use beeswax on your thread?
I use a shoemaker's wax, which is a recipe of beeswax, pine resin with a binder. And the binder I use is rabbit droppings. So it sounds really gross, but it's not. I mean, they eat hay, and I make my wax that way, and it works great.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. And I shared your Facebook page and web page in the chat. And I'm sure people would be happy to follow up through those avenues to contact you if they have questions. Have a great day, everyone.